the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. I'm Megan Mitchell, and joining me today and moderating is my fellow board member, Audrey Harris. Tonight's conversation stems from a letter written to our membership from our executive director, Brian Wiedenmeyer. In this letter, Brian acknowledges that out of 10,000 members of this organization, 80% are white people. That means white people have led everything from our leadership to our bicycle advocacy. As a result, we've failed to address and live up to this organization's mission of creating an organization fighting for safe, just, and livable streets. To achieve that mission, we must talk about race and take action for racial justice. It is no longer acceptable to operate under the flawed assumption that what is best for our membership is best for everyone.
The coalition at all levels of leadership have taken a step back to ask how we might become an anti-racist organization, and started with a strategic plan. Most recently, a decision was made to remove strategies that require police funding that go towards enforcement related to people on bikes. This work, although just a start, is a critical step in putting a stop to unnecessary attacks on Black and Brown communities. In addition to internal conversations, this event serves as the start to having these conversations with the coalition's membership and the broader advocacy community for people on bikes. In the spirit of late Congressman John Lewis, if you don't do everything you can to change things, then they will remain the same. You only pass this way once. You have to give it all you have. Tonight, we are joined by a panel that embodies that spirit. Megan and I are joined by the city's Director of Racial Equity, Shakira Simley, SFMTA Transportation Engineer, Area Ward, SFMTA Principal Transportation Planner, Kenya Wheeler, and Thrivance Group Strategic Planner, Brittany Brown.
This conversation will be recorded and is being streamed live on Facebook. Everyone who's RSVP to this event will receive a link to the event recording later this week. Immediately following the panel discussion, there will be an optional opportunity to join a virtual small group discussion with other event attendees. There will not, unfortunately, be an opportunity to ask questions during the webinar because we've received 400 questions in the event registration. However, we encourage you to stay engaged, as this will not be our only event focused on this topic. We will be posting a typed transcript of the event on our website later this week as well. At this time, we plan to pass it over to Supervisor Shimon Walton to kick off this panel discussion with opening remarks. Unfortunately, Supervisor Shimon Walton wasn't able to join us, but his office did send us remarks that I will read now. Since day one in office, Supervisor Walton has been working on equity and justice legislation with the goal of improving outcomes for Black people in San Francisco. Some of our equity and justice work includes shutting down juvenile hall by 2021, the Karen Act, reparations plan and advisory committee, sheriff's oversight, which is going on the ballot this November, Vision Zero on homicides and violent crimes plan, establishing a family relief fund for COVID-19, and more. Currently, we have a pending legislation declaring anti-Black racism as a public health and human rights crisis in partnership with the Human Rights Commission, which creates a framework for San Francisco to actively address anti-Black racism and work within the Office of Equity, Racial Equity in all programs. Anti-Black racism is hostility towards Black people and culture, manifested through individual, internalized, interpersonal, institutional, or systemic interactions, decisions, processes, and outcomes. Anti-Black racism is the explanation for health inequities and what creates disparities in the wealth gap, education, environment, economic opportunities, and housing that are all available for Black people. Our work is not done. It's just the beginning, and we thank you all at the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition and many allies for supporting our equity and justice work.
Thank you, Megan. At this time, we'd like the panel to introduce themselves, starting with Shakira, Ariel, Kenya, and then Brittany.
Thank you so much, Megan. Thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you so much to the San Francisco Bike Coalition. I'm so happy to be here and see all your shining faces, some serious Black excellence on this call. My name is Shakira Simley. I am the inaugural director for the Office of Racial Equity through the City and County of San Francisco. This office was legislated last July and signed into office by Mayor London Breed. And it sits under the San Francisco Human Rights Commission, which is led by Director Cheryl Evans Davis. And our goal through the Office of Racial Equity is to dismantle, address institutional, systemic, and interpersonal racism within city government and outside of city government as well. 6 months into the role, definitely have a full plate given the pandemics within pandemics that we're facing. But I've long had an interest in planning and community and economic development. From my experience as a food justice advocate to executive director for nonprofits, and also just as San Francisco citizen. I've lived here for 13 years. I'm originally from New York City. So I'm really excited to have a conversation that I feel like we've been needing to have within the bike community for a very long time. And hopefully, I'm hoping that this conversation spurs many other individual conversations, but also conversations that we need to be having within city government and within our planning processes. So that's just me. I'm gonna pass it off to Ariel.
Thank you for that. Super excited to be here with you all and see so many familiar faces. My name is Ariel Ward. I am a transportation planner and engineer by day, all things creative by night. I'm a proud alumna of Howard University, and I'm driven by community, compassion, and culture. I have a background in community-based transportation planning and engineering, and seek to understand how planning can be used to generate solutions in communities where it once furthered inequity. And I recognize transportation as a critical pathway to connecting people to people, resources, and opportunity, regardless of circumstances of their birth and background. So I'm currently at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, and I have been there for almost 4 years. And now.
Thanks, Ariel. And my name is Kenya Wheeler, and I am a principal transportation planner at the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. My work is focused on currently parking and curb management work. So I'm part of the team that oversees the citywide demand responsive parking pricing program and works on citywide parking policy. Looking at the curb as our unit of measurement and analysis, which is something that affects everyone, whether you're biking, driving, walking, taking transit. And I've come to this work actually more in my night work outside of the agency. I have been a longtime transportation, advocate and have worked quite a bit in the East Bay. I'm a native, born and raised in Berkeley, and we lived in the Bay Area most of my life, and I've really been working on trying to make sure that our transportation systems are open for everyone, whether you have access to public transit, bike, or car, and especially for communities or Black and brown communities that aren't always at the table. It's actually been interesting. I would say I've been probably oftentimes the only Black person at the table, and so it's been great to actually see all my other colleagues here on this panel, like the next generation of really planners and engineers and advocates stepping into this work. And that's been really a great thing to actually see that. Hopefully you can help work to pass the baton onto this next cohort to do even better things. In Oakland, I've worked, was on the founding member of the Oakland Bicyclist and Pedestrian Advisory Commission and served as chair in 2019, where we adopted a groundbreaking bicycle master plan that Brittany worked on. We'll hear more about that on this call tonight. And really excited to have the opportunity and thank Megan and Audrey and the SF Bike Coalition board and staff for putting this together, and looking forward to the conversation that we'll be having. And now I'll pass it on to Brittany.
Good evening, everybody. Really happy to be here, see everybody's faces. Brittany Brown. I currently am a strategic planner with the Thrivance Group. I also get to work alongside Ariel as we build up At the Intersections, publication via Medium, where we highlight, articles and stories for and by women of color. Very similarly to Kenya's story, I grew up in the Bay Area, a proud South Berkeley resident, or grew up there, South Berkeley native. I am an urban planner, and I believe in the healing of racialized people through the planning process. I say Black people over plans, people over planning. And I've really wanted to use the work that I've done in the planning field to build power and honor people's culture. I want to see people's their lived experiences reflected in our built environment. And so that is absolutely how I plan. It's very hard work. It hasn't always gained, I'm in good company today. I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, I think the conversation will expand and open up more, but really just want to shout out the work that I get to do at Thrivance. With a bunch of awesome women who have backgrounds in anthropology, cultural organizers, community organizers working on affordable housing. And we call that planning work. So just really excited to be here, happy to see that the SF Bike Coalition is wanting to engage in conversations that really center Black people, especially in the Bay Area. So just, happy to see everybody and excited for this conversation.
Awesome, thank you. So let's all get comfortable. We're about to dive into our questions, and this first question I think is kind of why we're all here, and it may sound like a very lofty question and can go many directions that I hope you all can tap into. But and Shakira, I'm going to start off with you if you don't mind. But the question we have that we want to kind of discuss is, how does anti-Blackness show up in our communities, in the biking community at large? How does it show up in planning around bike infrastructure and programming? That you all are planners and engineers and advocates in this work. How does that show up?
Thank you, Audrey. I think it's a great question, and I'm in fantastic company, so please feel free to interrupt me, check me, well, actually, all of that. So when we're thinking about, bike infrastructure and transportation infrastructure, the question I always come back to is, who are we building for? Who gets to use this? Who decided that this should be here? And what kind of history is inherited in our streets, in our sidewalks, in our transit networks that may inhibit folks from being able to move and to move freely. And when we're thinking about this, and I'm particularly coming from a city government perspective, I know we have a lot of work to do, because oftentimes we're not building for the folks whose lived experience should be paramount, for folks who might have been pushed out, for folks who, where I'm going to say, cars may be their economic lifeline to get to where they need to go, for folks who don't have a bus stop within walking distance of their homes, for folks who have to travel over, 2 or 3 miles just to go to the grocery store. So these are some of the questions that underline this, but I always come back to, who are we building for, who decided this needs to be here, and what history kind of set the groundwork for this infrastructure. What's woven into this, right? So we live in a racist society, which means that in whatever we do, from the interpersonal interactions, from our systems, we're always going to have racialized outcomes. We cannot separate those things. I think folks like to think that we can, but we cannot. And from my perspective, leading this Office of Racial Equity is acknowledging that truth, acknowledging that history, prioritizing intersections, and also rooting out anti-Blackness. Extremely important. And when we can have that acknowledgement and that grounding, we can move forward. And in understanding that as well, we need to understand that we're talking about racism and anti-Blackness, we're thinking about interpersonal racism, and we're also thinking about systemic racism. And those things work together neatly. And how that relates to transportation is a neatly way of putting this is thinking about like spatial awareness, which I think is very racialized, and also thinking about spatial segregation, right? So on one hand, with spatial awareness, where you have white folks who take up a lot of space because you've never been made to feel small in a public setting, or had to move or not be able to go into certain businesses, or go into certain neighborhoods, or even able to walk down a sidewalk freely. When I think about my grandmothers or great grandmothers in the South and how were they able to move and how I'm able to move. So because of that sense of entitlement that happens in our bike lanes and our sidewalks, that translates into a lack of spatial awareness, that translates into anti-Blackness and people not feeling like they can move freely in their own neighborhoods and spaces. That's directly correlated to spatial segregation. So there's a whole system of systemic racism based off of redlining, based off of exclusionary zoning, based off of transit planning that prioritize certain people's needs over others, right? Maybe I was commuting from the suburbs and coming into the city, so that means certain highways were built in low income or Black and brown neighborhoods versus the transit needs of people who actually live there. All those things wrapped together to create that spatial segregation, which is affirmed and perpetuated in our city infrastructure to this day. So when we're thinking about these things, we have to hold both. We have to tackle interpersonal racism as we were thinking about spatial awareness and who gets access to the sidewalk and who doesn't. And then we also think about spatial segregation and undoing that racist history, because we live in a society that will always produce racialized outcomes. So that's the kind of grounding I want to provide for that. But there's lots of different ways in which anti-Blackness shows up in cycling and biking. I'm tired. It is Monday. But I want to, throw it to one of our other panelists to kind of provide more of a frame as well. Thank you.
I think I agree, especially on the interpersonal piece. Like anti-Blackness shows up in the cycling community just as it shows up anywhere else. And as I was prepping for this panel, I came across a quote by Tony K. Brambara that's "Revolution begins with the self in the self." And I think a lot of this work is really internal work. Like as a planner, I like to say that I do heart work because that's what it is to pursue just outcomes. And so I think that what a lot of times we think of it, systemic racism, we think at a very high level, but it really begins on a very individual level. And there's a need to kind of shift what's happening at the micro level to move what's happening at the macro level. So when you talked about that, it definitely made me think of that aspect of needing to do this very in-depth personal work, but then how you have to also do that work in community. That's the only way that it moves. So I think it's really meaningful for us to be here today and start to be doing that work in community, and the Bicycle Coalition to also be doing that work in community. And so I think of it as you can't say, how do we increase bicycling in Black communities, but then you see a Black woman with a bike that's nicer than yours. Actually, somebody just told me this story on Friday that they were at a Target and somebody saw them with a really nice bike and they were like, "Did you steal that?" Those are the ways in which anti-Blackness shows up in the bicycling community. So it's macro and micro, and I think it's also paying attention to those ways, because even if you didn't approach that person, if you were even thinking about it, right? How did she get such a nice bike? You're complicit in that anti-Blackness.
Definitely. And that kind of brings me to a question about how, communities of color can support bicycling infrastructure. Ariel, since you kind of segued into that, maybe you could tell us, and it could be the wrong question, but would love to hear what you would have to say about that.
I'll get on the soapbox for a little bit, but I don't want to take up too much space because there's so many other great voices.
There's space and time for all of us. So.
I absolutely think that is the wrong question. And I get that question a lot, especially as an engineer, as a planner. How do we get communities of color supporting bicycling? And I'm like, you don't, that's the wrong question. And I think it's a question that inherently centers your own priorities, your own beliefs, your own values. I think that the real question is, how do we increase the mobility of Black communities, of communities of color? And I think bicycling is a means to an end. It's a part of expanding that mobility toolkit, but it's not the end itself. And so I absolutely think that that's the wrong question, but I'm gonna let some other folks jump in on that and maybe I'll tag back in.
Brittany, would love to hear your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even the title of this, panel, right? Like, and what it invites, like who is here currently and what are you hoping to glean from this conversation? And and by getting this information, then what are you, I think it's kind of agenda based, right? Like bike lanes, gentrification. Okay, I want a bike lane, but I don't want gentrification. How do I come, what does it look like for me to be in this space and like move my agenda forward? So just even, I know we're in this like really awesome space, just the 6 of us right now, or 8 of us, but I know there are other folks who are listening in. And if you've ever approached a conversation just so that you could continue to promote bike lanes, I think that is absolutely not what we're trying to do, right? We're talking about mobility. I think one of the things that really struck me about planning and working in government were the modality-based plans. I was so confused. I was like, so we have a bike plan, we have a pedestrian master plan. We're not talking about cars. We kind of have a parking plan, and it's not just one agency, but that's just kind of how cities work. And but it was really concerning because I knew that if we were focusing on just one mode, it wasn't going to be serving communities. And so a part of the work that I was doing when I was at the City of Oakland was to develop a mobility action plan, which would prioritize and really push the city to look at people and then look at their modes and what would it look like. And I think it was important to have it be a mobility action plan rather than a community-based transportation plan, because we're saying the marker for our success is not whether or not we'll engage community, because even that can be inflated or flawed, but that we are going to be looking at the mobility outcomes of these communities over the course of 1 to 5 to 10 years. We have a long range plan. So I think even just how, if we're thinking about anti-Blackness and how we get approached and tapped for information, it's just project by project. You know what I'm saying? Like folks are looking to put one bike lane on 4 blocks, but what about our entire community? 5, 6, 7 square miles with incredibly dense transportation networks. We have transit systems, streets, sidewalks, utilities. Like thinking about our communities wholly is the better approach, and really lends itself to closing racial disparities as it relates to transportation and mobility. So, you know, I get really amped up about the bike lane conversation, because I'm like, that's not what we're actually trying to increase mobility outcomes, right? And it's not just going to happen with this one bike lane. So have this conversation about all of the modes and what it looks like to increase our mobility. So I'll open it up, and I think Kenyon might have something to say. I saw him.
I did, Brittany. What you're stating is really that crux of the there's the, structural racism that with our planning practice exists in, and there's just in the institution of planning itself. You talked about the modality. Let's see. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
All right. I was going to say, so I was saying that the point you were making about modality is part of the structural blindness within the field of planning. We are so often focused on, as a practitioner, the particular mode that we are operating in, and not looking at the holistic link of how a system works together. And it's interesting because in grad school, we learn about systems theory and wicked problems. And then we go back, we go into the practice, we're in these silos where we don't talk to each other, both in terms of modes, in terms of agency, and between institutions and community. Of the key challenges that everyone in this work, whether you're a planner, whether you're a community member, whether you're an activist or an advocate, we've got to work together to like really break down those silos. And I feel like in this moment of where we're actually recognizing Black Lives Matter, I think that's, to me, like an indicative of our society really recognizing that these sort of foundational untruths, like that Black Lives Don't Matter, are not something that we're going to accept, that we're going to really be able to try it as a I hope as a nation. I think we're seeing this now that folks are saying, yeah, this is not acceptable and we need to move on. And I think that with what that relates to in our work is not accepting the sort of status quo of, we have community engagement that like speaks to people, but doesn't really actually include their concerns. It doesn't really actually funds their concerns. I mean, I feel like we've gone through this cycle in my career where we like, went through this whole movement towards environmental justice. We had, Clinton's executive order back in '96. We've now gone through, and it's part and parcel of our federally funded plans. We have a state law that requires environmental justice integrated into general plans. I mean, we're seeing that now happening in transportation plans. But then there's like, you do all these plans, and I think as planning practitioners, we see this. What happens once those plans are approved? How are they actually being operationalized? And that, I think, is the next really endeavor that we all need to break into, is like making sure that there's money behind it. One of the things that I know Brittany and I saw in Oakland is that when we went to community members and asked them about bike lanes, they were like, well, bike lanes are great, but like, I don't have a bike. Like, I wanted to have my kids ride, but I don't have money for a bike. Like, is there a program that you could set up so that kids can learn in the school, perhaps, if I don't have time because I'm working a couple of jobs? I mean, I actually learned how to ride from someone at a school because that was a way to actually help me with basically as I was, in high school and trying to find a way to connect with folks. It was like a school staff member took me in and actually on the weekend taught me how to ride because my mom hadn't ridden a bike in decades, didn't have a bike. And so, I was really fortunate and privileged that I was in a school district that allowed for that to happen. It wasn't Berkeley. And I know in Oakland, it's super under-resourced. There are programs now that are funded, but only a fraction of schools that need that kind of assistance actually have the funding. So like Bike East Bay provides funding in the schools that they are funded to cover. That's not all of Oakland. And that's just one district in the Bay Area, one area in the country where, so that's the type of scaling that I think needs to be done. It's like we have to look at not just what we do here in the city in San Francisco, but also what are we doing as a region? What are we doing as a nation to really address these things? And like we right now have an opportunity with the federal transportation legislation being reauthorized. And we're all in the midst of this pandemic. There's so many crises, like Shakira is saying, like, we have pandemics, more pandemics. But I think one thing to, I put to the panel and also to participants is like, think about what can you be advocating for now at that federal level that could actually create a systemic change to move the needle in the right direction. So that's something I want to point out. And I just wanted to kind of talk about the anti-Blackness piece. I just wanted to just bring up something, like I was doing a little research before this about, so my journey into cycling really was a way to like kind of give myself a sense of like, being able to have mobility and have freedom that I didn't have a car when I was a kid. And it was kind of, where I was in West Berkeley was, pretty far from all that cool stuff in downtown or in Telegraph. So biking was a way for me to, get out there, connect with some friends and get out. But the issue of like, and Ariel made this, I think she posted think she posted on Twitter, but it's this amazing quote that I thought that I just keeps reverberating in my mind, and that's, this statement that Black mobility has always been a source of white anxiety. And, I was doing some research on Blackness and cycling, and I came across a name that many of your advocates have heard of before, Major Taylor, Marshall Walter Taylor. And, he was really, if you don't know, he's a Black American. He was born 13 years after slavery ended. He was, I think, really the first national level sports celebrity. And he was as a kid, he actually worked at a bike store in Indianapolis because he was doing bike tricks, which actually is interesting. As a story, his family gave him a bike, his white family who he was friends with, gave him a bike when they moved away. He parlayed that into becoming one of the top athletes of his time in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and was the first national Black sports star. But I found a really crazy story about it. Every time he was racing, there were instances where white cyclists didn't want to ride with him, which, it's almost kind of reminded of the echo that we're seeing now, where sports athletes who are kneeling and protesting the treatment of Black bodies by our state are being shunned by some of their teammates. When Major Taylor was racing, there was actually two incidents where he was actually attacked by other racers in the middle of the race, where someone tried to throw him off his bike. You can try to check someone off their a leg in the spoke, throw him off. And actually the second time this happened in Australia, he actually was unconscious, and the ruling was that the person who did this to him got a year suspended sentence. So the travesties that we're seeing now and what's happening to Black bodies, just in terms of the larger context of our society, we've even seen that happening in cycling. I mean, that was 100 years ago, but it's 100 years later, we're still seeing echoes of that in our society. So this anti-Blackness and mobility, I think, is something that we should all reflect on. What are we doing in our policies to provide real equity for Black bodies, for brown bodies? And I think one of the things I've always noticed is that what happens to Black folks, what happens to brown folks, will eventually happen to the rest of society. So it's if we're not taking care of the most vulnerable, we all will be paying the price down the road.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I actually am just curious, now that we're in, a situation in San Francisco where we're dealing with various micromobility companies coming in. I know because I used to work at one of them. What do you think would be good ways for these companies to engage with the Black community on an authentic level? I want everybody to answer that one. I'll start with you, Ariel.
Oh, okay. And also thanks for sharing the quote, Kenya. That was by Dr. Allison Hobbs, who has studied the role of automobiles in Black communities, the societal and cultural roles. And she was exploring the ways in which they put limitations on how Black people could travel through cars. And so I would explore us to be understanding how that can also be happening in the ways that Black people can travel on bikes. And I think that when you do get to the question of, how do you increase mobility in Black communities and start to expand that toolkit to include these micro mobility options, I think that it's experiential. It starts by, getting people out and having them experience it. Just yesterday, my friend was like, oh, I would love to bike around Oakland today. And I was like, or one day. And I was like, oh, that could be today. Let's go. And we biked around the lake twice. Or I would make bets with friends if they lost a bet, next thing they're on a bike and they're like, this is not so bad. And they're texting me and they're like, I think I want a bike. Or so it has to be experiential. People have to, it's our role to help people understand how cycling or micro mobility can fit into their daily lives. And I talk about my experience with bike share and that When I first started using it, I think I took it just like downhill to the grocery store because I was like, I didn't want to walk. I was being lazy. But one day I missed the bus and I was like, that bus is not coming for a cool like 30 minutes. So I was like, let me see what this bike share is talking about. And I hopped on a bike share bike and I beat the bus. And I was like, if I could beat the bus, I'm never taking the bus again. And then I started biking, every morning to BART instead of taking the bus. And that was like one of the highlights of my day. So it's starting to, it's really experiential and getting communities out there. And then I think also there are people, like I think there's this question of like, how do we engage authentically? There are people who have been doing this work. There are people who know how to do this work. So if you don't know, like there are people out there who do, and you should be hiring them. You should be paying them. You should be listening to them. They maybe should have your job. I don't know, but I'm just saying, like, there's people out here who know how to do this work, and there's plenty. So that's my 2 cents.
I'm like, say it again. Say it again. Shakira.
I would just add to that, it is experiential, and it also makes a difference when the person providing the experience looks like you. So I think there's like comfort and trust with that, which is really important. I have, it has been really affirming and heartwarming to me to see how some of our young Black and brown youth are like using like scooters and bike shares to like go to parts of the city that maybe they've never been to before, or get to where they need to go and just kind of be free. Like, I just want Black kids to be free and just like be kids. And we don't often allow them that space, literally. And I was sharing with you all a moment when I was in like Chicago and seeing like how a lot of the kids like use the divvy bikes there to like just kind of like roll through downtown, or like, go by Millennium Park, or just like be in spaces that are like not meant for them, but they can get there and be there easily and cheaply. And because we don't have a lot of spaces for our young people to congregate, to gather, to be free and not be monitored and policed, as we all are in our communities. So, and then also from, prior to this job, I worked in City Hall as a legislative aide and dealt with a lot of these, some of these companies. And I think definitely like not treating a city like your own like blank canvas. Like, if you're gonna be installing something, like giving the neighbors like a heads up when you're pulling permits, like talking to folks, getting their buy-in, asking where they want it. You may not know where's the best place to put a bike share, or maybe people don't want a bunch of scooters like right in front of their grandma's like ADA like ramp. So I think it's important to make sure that companies take a lot more social responsibility in connecting to community way before they're bringing those assets to community, and then definitely paying folks for their time and their insight, just like you would any, support McKinsey or Bain, whatever consultant from the East Coast that told you that this was a good idea. There's a lot of Black and brown expertise that can do just the same. So pay up.
Thank
so
you.
I want to definitely co-sign that piece.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Brittany and Kenya.
Yeah, I would say everything, yes, to what the panelists have said. I also want to make sure that we hold government accountable. I saw a lot of kind of responsibility being shifted towards the mobility companies. And at the same time, there are absolutely things government should be requiring companies to do, and to see themselves as the oversight body and not as this like passive agency. So absolutely making sure that there are deployment stations distributed geographically throughout the city, being agnostic in their approach. So what does it look like to have a website that allows all of the scooter micromobility companies to be present, and it's sponsored by city of whatever. But everybody knows, like, generally this is what a scooter is. Generally, this is what bike share is. So, you know, I tend to be having the agency government background, and also having a background working in a nonprofit that was responsible and in partnership with for Go Bike and their expansion regionally, saw the gaps, and, you know, transit should be free. So I think micromobility should be free or, you know, deeply subsidized. And we were able to make it deeply subsidized in the rollout, and it had huge impacts on who was accessing it. I think in the height of our Bike Share for All work that we were doing, I think 80 to 90% of all the folks that we signed up were Black folks making under $25,000. You know, and so we were able to, those are the kinds of outcomes that I think we should be thinking about. And so it does take micromobility and having them do that work, but also absolutely holding government accountable. And then just to get back to the experiential piece, when I was working at the city of Oakland, project managing the scraper bike lane, we did community cleanups monthly, and Ariel and Kenya would come through, and we had one event where we partnered with Spin to bring scooters out. And, you know, obviously the youth, you have to be over the age of 18 to ride the scooter, but they brought free socks, they brought helmets. So there were young people who could ride in the street with us. So the adults were on, and we worked with like the elders, and they were able to kind of learn how to scoot. And then you had the youth with their helmets on. And I think about that story because that lane in and of itself is a culture marker. Shakira earlier mentioned like spatial awareness, and how, and I would love for us to kind of talk about this as even challenging this notion that like a bike lane equals safety. And I just don't buy that at all. It's white paint. You know what I'm saying? Like, there are other things in the built environment that make me feel safe, that is not white paint. So just even the fact that we had young people gravitating towards us in the middle of the street because the paint was orange and it was bright. You know what I'm saying? Like, I feel safe when I hear music. I'm walking down the street and I can hear, you know, loud music. There are other things that are out there. So even just challenging these notions of like what it means to feel safe, and what are we pushing, and who is it for, is just something that I've been thinking about too. So I know this isn't about micromobility, but I thought the spatial awareness piece was really critical, and I just wanted to make sure that we got back to that too.
Oh.
Yeah, that's a really good point you bring up, Brittany, of spatial awareness, messaging, and what does harmful messaging look like. In our pre-conversation, we talked about messaging around banning cars, more bike lanes with white paint, and that coalition should be only focusing on biking and bike infrastructure. I'd love to hear from the panel on kind of through their work and through their experience, how are these messages harmful? Like, we talked about government's role at the federal, state, and local level. Like, how are these messages harmful to our communities potentially?
Well, I can start off and then definitely want to have open it up. You know, it's, you know, there's as advocates for community-based transportation, for sustainable transportation, I think a lot of times the normative narrative is that, yeah, like cars are bad, and that, you know, we need to deprioritize them. And in a lot of ways, in terms of safety and outcomes, environmental outcomes, there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also a reality that, especially for folks who are if they're in a community where they don't have good transit access, and I'm thinking like even parts of San Francisco, parts of the Southeast, where there's very, very limited connections between neighborhoods and downtown, like in the Bayview, parts of his valley, uh, and where individuals are working not the kind of privileged jobs that we have. I mean, as you know, as a public servant, I have a privilege of like working in an office and having a defined time when I can be in. I'm working from home right now. Many folks they're having to go to work right now on when a mini bus when they can get on if it's not overcrowded, um, or they're driving. And so there's a reality that in a lot of Black communities, like having a car is an access point for mobility. It's also a point of status. There was many years where it's like if you didn't have resources, you were taking transit, and it's almost like a rite of passage that if you received wealth, a better job, you were able to buy a car, and that was a sense of showing status. And there's a whole, it's kind of like I hate to it's like we don't talk about this, but it's so true that like a car in a lot of ways can be a sense of status. And I think one of the challenges that a kind of privileged view of cycling has to take is that we have to recognize that that is a case, that is a norm that we have to be cognizant of and to not totally dismiss. Now, there are lots of ways you can do that. The question I think is like, how do we reach people where they're at? And if we're wanting to like really embrace like a greener lifestyle, what are culturally relevant ways of doing that? Like in Oakland, there's the scraper bike team, right? And they get a lot of accolades, but really they started working with youth, and like that. Not only is that like to me one of the best places to start, because it's like you change the minds of a kid, you can change the minds of society. And they've been able to create a whole culture around tricking out your bike, right? Showing the bike as a cool thing to do. And so like, how do we scale those kinds of organic community solutions to really start changing there? I think that's one approach. But I think also like the point that Brittany made about, paint isn't safety is unfortunately something I think see coming up over and over again. Like I remember some of y'all old heads will remember this, where like we talked about vehicular cycling. It was like, oh, you got to be if you're a biker. This was like older white folks talking about this. I remember reading this when I was in high school. It's like you got to be in the middle of the street and like out there biking and like show the cars what you're going to do. And like that means you're likely to get hit by a 3,000-pound SUV. So, and even with the paint line, we know that drivers aren't going to obey that. With protected bike facilities, that gives you a modicum of safety, but you have a K71 plastic barrier between you and a 45-mile-an-hour car. That driver slips over, you're done. So there's another thing which I think we all, as cyclists, as advocates, as planners, got to like look at: how do we actually reach people who are driving? Because that's the folks we actually want to let them know that like there's those signs that it says like drive like your kid lives here. Well, I mean, you see those in certain communities. You don't, but I've never seen a culturally specific one talking to Black folks saying like, like, yeah, this is your kid, your homies are here. Like, so there's these, again, sort of good steps of like how we might reframe, but we got to do it in a way that's in people's context.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the car situation is definitely nuanced and definitely worth having, and it's not for white communities or advocates to walrus on behalf of like environmentalism and silence and drown people out as to why they're driving. And from a government perspective, I'm seeing people use their cars because it's an economic lifeline, because they're super commuters, so they can't bike to work because they increasingly are being pushed out of the neighborhoods where they grew up, so they have to travel further to work. So it's difficult for them to do that. For folks who, this is everybody who have families, if you have kids or children or smart kids, like you may not necessarily be able to bike or feel safe biking with your child. So you may have to adapt to a car in order to do that. For some folks, and this is a difficult conversation, but their vehicle is their home. A lot of people, our vehicularly housed population has gone up exponentially in California. So people are using their car to get to work and also to keep a roof over their head as well. And also, we haven't solved for the fact that we're not building, we're not having how do I say this? We're not, like if we're having these conversations, it needs to be coupled with a thoughtful approach on how we're gonna push for greater transit equity in neighborhoods that have been historically left behind, defunded, and divested in. So like if we're gonna talk about bike lanes, it's a yes and I would say that's at the bottom of the priority list when it comes to things like, you know, better transit, safer transit, you know, our streets are not filled with potholes, our sidewalks aren't cracked, like, right, our kids can safely, you know, walk to and from and not, you know, subject to accidents. They actually have sidewalks. I mean, there's so many different things that if you ask folks why they're driving or, you know, what the impetus is behind this, I think you will get a more nuanced answer, particularly within the Black community. And I'd also say, like, yes, like there is a class component to this for folks, which is really important in part of our culture, that is worth exploring and talking amongst ourselves. But I think these are the considerations that I want to make sure that we're having around greater transit equity when we're just talking about bike lanes. And when we say the C word, cars, and people are clutching their pearls, I'm just not really here for it. I'm just like, you haven't done the work and you haven't talked to people and you are not connecting with the folks who may disagree with you. Also, just because you know, folks drive doesn't mean that they don't care about the environment. Like that is that false dichotomy, we need to dead that in the water, right? When I think of, prime example, when I think of, you know, folks in the Bayview in the Southeast who may have to use their cars to drive to work, they are OG environmental activists. You know why? Because they're fighting against the tainted shipyards. They're the ones fighting against the PG&E stations. They're the ones fighting against the wastewater sewer treatment plant facing their neighborhoods. So you can't tell me that Black people don't care about the environment and environmental justice when they have laid the groundwork for some of our most powerful environmental justice moves. And just because they're not prioritizing bike lanes, can't, like, now I'm getting hyped up. I'm gonna put myself on mute. Somebody else is gonna have to jump in because I'm getting mad. But you know, like we have to like really, I'm gonna call a spade here. And I just think that this transparency and this honesty here, like we have to get super, super real. What are we actually saying? And it is a racialized conversation. It is. And we need to move beyond that. And we need some more cultural humility when it comes to this conversation. And be able to hopefully step back and have this more nuanced approach.
Co-sign all of that, like super heavy. And I feel like both Shakira, you and Kenya were speaking to like two really, I think, important things to this conversation. One is holding the tension. Like you just listed off maybe like 10 things to consider, you know, as we think about what bike infrastructure and cycling looks like in Black communities. And same to what Kenya was mentioning earlier. And then I think what you also mentioned in speaking of like, just because it doesn't look like your way, just because it doesn't look like your experience doesn't mean it's the right way or it's the wrong way. And I think sometimes when I hear the question of like, how do we get more Black people on bikes as if, you know, we're not biking, sometimes I hear like, you know, how do I get Black communities to do this my way or in a way that centers, you know, what I want? And I hear, how do I get this bike lane in a Black community so I can bike through it on the way to my white one? And, you know, in this work, I hear a lot that Black communities, whether it's a highway or it's a bike lane, they're tired of their communities being looked at as a thoroughfare. And so I think that the way that you start to engage it is to hold the tension, is to, you know, decenter your priorities, is to, you know, consider center another experience. And then another thing that I wanted to also say is Kenya's point about starting with the youth as well. I know this is a little bit outside of the car piece, but I think it's really important to when it comes to expanding mobility of Black communities, starting with youth and exposing them to these different ways of traveling. But that tension piece is so critical. And then I think to Brittany's safety piece as well, that's something as a Black engineer doing work in Bayview Hunters Point, doing work in the Western Addition is something that the community has, that's tension I have to hold, because that's questions that they're asking me. You know, they're saying safety for who? And I think one of the there's like one of the experiences that really shifted my understanding of safety, even though, you know, I navigate this experience as a Black woman, was the work that has been done, excuse me, in the Tenderloin around the Compton Cafeteria Transgender District, and hearing Janelle, I'm blanking on her last name, one of the
Janetta Johnson, Aria,
and then Janelle, I thought it was
and
Janelle.
Janetta. Oh, no, Janelle, yeah.
No.
She's part of transgender, yeah, Janelle, yeah.
Speaking about what like having these markers in public space meant. So, you know, having decorative crosswalks, having the light poles wrapped with the transgender flag, like what that meant to them as Black trans women in that space. And to me, it just shifted my understanding of safety to a different level as an engineer. To, you know, we look at, once again, as Brittany said, the white paint, but you know, what does it mean when a Black trans woman is saying this is in a world that is, you know, can be inherently unsafe for Black trans women. When I see these elements of myself in public space, it feels safe for me to be here and to take up space and to feel like I belong here. So I really wanted to also speak to the element, one, to the incredible work that they're doing, and two, to just that element of, you know, redefining or understanding safety in this space.
I mean, what can I say after all of that gloriousness? This is amazing. One thing that I'll uplift is this idea that, like, if we keep using bike lanes as our safety metric, that's the only data that we'll be able to measure. And so I think you said this earlier, Kenya, like, yeah, there are outcomes, there are safety related outcomes attached to, you know, you put a bike lane in and bam, it lessens or reduces collisions. But that's the only thing that we've really been promoting and uplifting. And so that's, I think, if we want people to bike, we might stop talking about bike lanes and maybe traffic calming, diverters. I've seen bulb outs, concrete bulb outs work really well for folks. I've seen traffic circles work really well in communities. And we have to be willing to fund those things as well. So I just want, like getting very clear about what it is that we want. Is it that we want people to bike, or is it that we want people to have bike lanes? And I think those are kind of two, they don't have to be, they're not one and the same. And just being very clear about what our goals are, and being committed to paying for those things, because I've seen it to where the only way our communities will get approached is if we decide we'll take on that infrastructure. But there are other things that we need. Shakira, you mentioned earlier the curb ramps, we need utility upgrades, all those things. But it's like, are we only going to get those things because we decide we'll put this infrastructure that doesn't necessarily jive with like our community? Is that the only way we'll get access to these resources? And that's what kind of frustrates me. So I would love for us to have that conversation of like, if we want to be increasing mobility, what is the full range of options? Can we be more imaginative and bold in our thinking? What are some new tools, and who do we need to engage to make those tools actually become, you know, a thing and look like infrastructure? So
thank you so much for that. And we've reached our time. We, of course, still have so many more questions, and we want to continue to stay engaged. Wonderful conversation. I want to thank our panelists for taking time to chat with us tonight. We really appreciate you all. As we said, we have a long way to go, but conversations like tonight's are where we start. I also want to thank Supervisor Shimon Walton for his hard work, not only in District 10, but citywide. And we're not an organization without our membership. To all the 10,000 plus of you, we appreciate your dedication to the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. And last but definitely not least, our staff and board. Thank you. Now, join us for a virtual small group discussion. We'll be putting the link in the post-event and a small group discussions in the chat. If you're watching this video live, we'll be putting a link in the comments. And if you're interested in joining us, click on that link and we'll see you in a second. Thank you guys once again. It was wonderful, guys and gals. Appreciate you. And
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. This is great.
Thank you.